Imagine being trapped in a place where the people sworn to protect you become your worst nightmare. Where every glance, every touch, every command could destroy your life, and no one listens. This is the story of Imani and Tasha, two women in maximum security, living under the shadow of a man who thought he was untouchable. He humiliated them, he preyed on them, and for weeks he got away with it. But one hidden camera, one act of courage, changed everything. What was captured behind those prison walls will shock you, horrify you, and leave you asking, how could anyone think this was justice? Stay with us, because what happened next is both terrifying and inspiring, and it's a story the world needed to see. The cameras didn't lie. Every frame told a story no one wanted to see, a truth so horrifying it made the air in the prison thick with fear. In the cold, gray halls of maximum security, Imani had learned to keep her head down, to survive in silence. But nothing could have prepared her for what was coming. It started subtly at first. A whispered command here, a suspicious pat down there. Most of the women tried to ignore it, pretending it wasn't happening. But Tasha noticed something that no one could ignore. Women were disappearing into the guard's office for routine checks and coming back. Changed, confused, scared, and pregnant. One by one, the pattern became impossible to deny, and behind it all was Richard, the guard everyone feared. To him, he was untouchable, untamed, a man above the rules, arrogant, controlling, cruel. He strutted through the hallways as if he owned not just the prison, but the women in it. His confidence was a mask, but the cameras didn't blink. Every heinous act, every vile intention was caught in silent, merciless footage. Imani felt it the day she realized he was watching her, studying her, planning. She could feel the predator lurking behind his polite facade, the power he wielded over life and freedom. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her, suffocating the hope that justice could ever reach these halls. But what she didn't know was that the very walls holding her captive were recording everything, the proof of evil that even Richard couldn't erase. Tasha whispered in the dark, her voice trembling. Imani, the cameras, they've got everything. If anyone sees this, he'll pay. But could anyone really stop him before it was too late? Or was the system that was supposed to protect them broken beyond repair? And then came the day that changed everything. The day the footage finally surfaced, exposing the truth the world wasn't ready to face. The cold, calculated face of Richard Langford, smiling as he walked the corridors with impunity, now frozen on screen, condemned by the very evidence he thought he controlled. But what happened next would shock everyone. How did Imani and the other women survive his reign of terror? And how did justice finally catch up with a man who thought he could escape it forever? Stay with us, because the truth behind maximum security is darker, more chilling and more shocking than you could ever imagine. Before the darkness crept into her life, Imani had a routine that felt simple yet safe. She woke to the early morning sun filtering through the small window of her modest apartment. The smell of brewing coffee, the soft hum of the city outside, and the occasional laughter from neighbors in the courtyard were her small comforts. She worked at a local library, surrounded by books that let her escape if only for a moment. From the struggles of the world outside, Tasha, her closest friend since childhood, often met her during lunch breaks. They would sit under a tree outside the library, sharing jokes and dreams, plotting a life bigger than the one the city seemed to hand them. Imani loved those moments, the ordinary warmth of friendship, the laughter that made the world feel lighter. She had hopes, ambitions, a sense of self that felt unshakable. But even in those peaceful days, shadows lingered. The subtle glances when she passed certain strangers, the dismissive remarks from a few coworkers, and the way some doors seemed to close faster when she approached, hinted at a world that didn't always welcome her. She shook off the unease, convincing herself it was paranoia. Yet deep down, she knew society's prejudice never slept. It was easy to forget that outside the library's quiet walls, a system existed that didn't value her in the same way it valued others. A system ready to judge her not by her character, but by the color of her skin. And while Imani and Tasha laughed under the midday sun, They were unaware of the storm gathering beyond their safe routines. A storm that would soon crash down on the women of their community in a place they could never escape. Maximum security. The calm, familiar world that Imani trusted was only temporary. The injustice, cruelty, and betrayal were waiting, patient and invisible, ready to strike when she least expected it. The calm of Imani's life was shattered the day she stepped into maximum security. The heavy steel doors slammed behind her, echoing like a warning. The air was thick with cold, fear, and distrust. She tried to steady herself, holding on to the hope that she could survive, that the injustice she sensed in the outside world would be tempered here. But Richard was already watching. His eyes followed her, sharp and calculating. He moved through the prison like a predator, confident that no one could challenge him. At first, the harassment was subtle, a hand lingering too long during searches, whispers in the hallway, unsolicited advice in his cold, arrogant voice. Imani froze, heart pounding, but tried to keep calm, telling herself that endurance was survival. Tasha noticed it immediately. She grabbed Imani in the corner of the rec room, her voice trembling with urgency. "He's testing us," she warned. "Every rule, every smile, he's pushing boundaries. We have to be careful." But caution wasn't enough. Richard escalated his actions, exploiting his position. He humiliated the women publicly, forcing them to obey arbitrary rules, mocking their dignity, making their lives inside a supposedly secure system a living nightmare. The injustice was everywhere. Requests for protection were ignored. Complaints disappeared into bureaucratic voids. Guards whispered that the inmates asked for it, and any attempt to appeal was met with laughter or threats. Every day the women endured, but the tension built like a storm cloud ready to explode. Then came the first pregnancy. Whispers filled the block. Fear turned to shock. The cameras, though silent, had captured Richard's cruelty, but no one in authority had acted yet. Imani felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Could she and Tasha be next? How long before the system itself betrayed them completely? Imani's frustration turned into determination. She started observing, taking mental notes of Richard's movements, learning the prison's patterns, searching for a way to protect herself and the others. But each night, as the metal bars cast long shadows across the cell floor, the tension grew unbearable. Every cough, every footstep in the hallway became a potential threat. Every camera blinked silently, a witness she desperately hoped would speak. By the end of the week, the tension was unbearable. Richard's arrogance grew. The women's fear deepened. One night, Tasha whispered, eyes wide and shaking, "Imani, if the cameras weren't there, he would have gotten away with everything already." A chill ran down Imani's spine. The proof existed, but the danger was still alive, breathing, moving, watching. And then, something happened that none of them expected. A slip, a mistake that would change everything. The prison was silent that night, but the silence was electric, tense, suffocating, waiting to erupt. Imani and Tasha huddled in the corner of their cell, whispering in low, urgent tones. The air smelled of metal and sweat, the faint hum of fluorescent lights casting long, wavering shadows across the cold concrete floor. All the cameras. "They have him. Every single move," Tasha murmured, her fingers trembling as she clutched a small, hidden notebook of observations. "If we time it right, we can expose him. Make them see what he's done," Imani's heart pounded. Fear clawed at her chest, but something deeper stirred. Anger, determination, a refusal to be broken. For weeks, she had endured humiliation, harassment, and injustice. She had watched friends suffer. She had felt the cold indifference of a system that was supposed to protect them. And now, the moment of reckoning was here. Richard strutted down the hall, his boots echoing like a countdown to terror. The arrogance in his stride, the smug smile he wore, made Imani's stomach churn. But she refused to show weakness. Every instinct screamed for caution, but she had waited too long to stay silent. The plan was simple but risky. Imani and Tasha had memorized the guard rotations, studied the blind spots, and marked the timing of the cameras. Tonight, they would ensure the evidence was undeniable. And tonight, Richard would finally see that he was not untouchable. Richard entered the block, his eyes scanning the cells. He stopped at one door, knocking lightly but authoritatively. "Open up," he commanded. Imani and Tasha pretended to comply, luring him into the trap they had carefully set. Suddenly, the security camera above the corridor blinked red, capturing every motion. In the shadows, Tasha pressed a hidden button, sending a direct feed to the prison administration and law enforcement outside. The guard's smug expression faltered as multiple screens lit up with live footage of his crimes. Clear, undeniable, inhuman. Richard's face twisted from arrogance to shock, then fury. What is this?" he bellowed, trying to grab the cameras, but it was too late. Every inch of his power was collapsing in real time, exposed to the world he thought he controlled. Imani stepped forward, her voice steady and unwavering despite the fear twisting through her body. "No more hiding, no more lies. This ends tonight." A tense silence followed. Other inmates peeked from their cells, wide-eyed, sensing the shift. Richard lunged, but with the guards called in by the live feed, he was restrained within seconds. His fury turned to desperation, but the evidence was absolute, unarguable, and unstoppable. For the first time, Imani felt the heavy weight of fear begin to lift. But the journey wasn't over. Richard was only one man, and the system he exploited had almost succeeded in silencing them. She stared at the screens, seeing the truth unfold, knowing that justice was finally within reach, but the aftermath, the reckoning, was still to come. And as the prison doors clanged shut behind the officers restraining Richard, Imani whispered, barely audible over her own heartbeat, "We survived." But the story isn't over yet. The prison felt different the next morning. The usual hum of fluorescent lights and distant clanging of metal doors was replaced by an almost surreal stillness. Imani and Tasha sat on the narrow bench in their cell, the weight of the previous night slowly sinking in. Richard, the man who had terrorized them and so many others, had been restrained, exposed, and powerless. For the first time, they allowed themselves to breathe without fear. Outside the prison walls, the live footage had created a ripple effect. The administration, embarrassed by the magnitude of the scandal, had no choice but to take immediate action. Richard Langford was arrested formally and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, harassment, and abuse of power. The court hearings were swift yet meticulous. Every frame of the security footage, every note Tasha had kept, every testimony from the women was brought forward as irrefutable evidence. The judge, moved by the courage of the survivors and the clarity of the documentation, sentenced Richard to 100 years in prison. It was a punishment that could never fully erase the pain he caused, but it was justice. For Imani and Tasha, the victory was deeply personal. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about reclaiming their dignity and their voices. The months that followed were emotionally complex. Therapy sessions, group counseling, and peer support helped the women process the trauma they had endured. While the physical scars faded over time, the psychological resilience they built would last a lifetime. They became advocates within the prison, working to ensure no woman would ever have to suffer in silence again. The ripple of Richard's exposure went beyond the prison walls. News outlets covered the story, sparking nationwide conversations about abuse, systemic racism, and accountability within law enforcement institutions. The scandal prompted policy changes in several prisons, including mandatory surveillance upgrades, transparent complaint procedures, and independent oversight committees to prevent future abuse. For many, this was the first step toward a justice system that could actually protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. Yet, even in victory, the story carried weighty lessons. Imani often reflected on the subtle ways society had prepared the ground for someone like Richard to thrive. From the dismissive glances outside the prison to the bureaucracy that ignored cries for help, the system had repeatedly failed to protect those at the margins. She realized that courage alone, while powerful, was not enough. Change required vigilance, collective action, and unwavering resolve. Tasha, equally reflective, reminded her friends daily, "We survived because we looked out for each other. Because we refused to stay silent. That's how we fight hate. It doesn't matter how strong the oppressor seems. Unity is stronger." Their words became a mantra for the women in the prison. Stories of oppression, once whispered in fear, began to be shared openly, creating solidarity that could never be broken. For the broader community, the story became a cautionary tale. It illustrated how racism, prejudice, and unchecked authority could destroy families, shatter trust, and poison institutions. It also demonstrated the power of courage, evidence, and unity to bring healing and accountability. Communities that had previously turned a blind eye were forced to confront uncomfortable truths, and slowly, reforms began to take root. In the months after the trial, Imani and Tasha organized a small support network within the prison. They taught other women to document injustices, to advocate for themselves, and to use technology wisely. They shared strategies for mental resilience, encouraging mindfulness, journaling, and open communication among inmates. Even small victories, like ensuring a respectful transfer of prisoners or addressing harassment promptly, became emblematic of the change they had sparked. On a personal level, both women found renewed purpose. Imani returned to her love for books and education, volunteering to teach literacy and life skills to fellow inmates. Tasha focused on mentorship, guiding the younger women through the complex emotional landscape of prison life. Together, they created a community that not only survived the horrors of injustice, but thrived because of their courage and commitment to each other. And yet, the memory of Richard's tyranny never fully faded. It served as a reminder that vigilance was essential, that society must actively confront prejudice wherever it hides. But every time Imani and Tasha looked around at the women supporting one another, at the small changes taking hold in the system, they felt hope. The darkness had not won. Courage had prevailed. Unity had prevailed. And healing, slowly but surely, was spreading. The story concluded not with a perfect ending, but with a powerful lesson. Racism destroys families. Prejudice weakens communities, but courage, unity, and truth can defeat even the most entrenched hate. And as Imani whispered to Tasha during one quiet evening in the cell, "We survived, and now no one else has to suffer in silence." The weight of fear finally lifted. The prison walls remained, cold and gray, but inside them resilience, justice, and hope now lived, and nothing could take that away.